So I have to give my traditional intro. Hi, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation. Very glad to have you here today. If you're watching on YouTube, we certainly appreciate you joining us there as well. If you have any questions and you are watching the recording of this, I would encourage you go ahead and put that question down in the comment section. I will see it, be able to return and answer that question for you. And if for some reason I don't know the answer, I'll be happy to track that answer down and we'll get that to you. So today we are going to be talking about organic gardening. And this is a topic I get a lot of questions about because a lot of people are interested in it for a variety of reasons. And so I'm going to go into that just a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the debate about organic gardening versus conventional gardening, but I do want to spend just a few minutes on it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the certification process that goes into commercially produced organic gardens or organic produce. And then I'm going to mention probably the biggest areas for organic gardening, which is fertilization and insect pest management and disease management, a little bit about weed management as well. And provide some methods for addressing those challenges with organic methods. So, to begin with, what is organic gardening in the first place? And really, this is a definition that is put forward by the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and more narrowly by the Agriculture Marketing Service. And was really in response to the desire of some producers to have this certification system and label for organic produce. And by that definition, organic agriculture produces products using methods that preserve the environment and avoid most synthetic materials, including things like pesticides and antibiotics, but also using naturally or organically or uh, products that are derived either from a natural source or as the end product of some natural process. All of the standards for organic production are set forth in the Organic Foods Production Act, and there is a fairly thorough description of what constitutes or what can constitute an organic product and what would not. Um, the goal of the organic program, as it is expressed, is to preserve natural resources and biodiversity, to use only those materials that are approved for organic production. There are no, as an extension of what is part of those requirements is that genetically engineered or genetically modified ingredients or plants are not used in organic production. Um, Organic production requires an on site inspection of the production to demonstrate that everything is being done according to those standards. And that is an ongoing process. So, an organic producer will need to have regular inspections to show that they are doing things as appropriate for those rules. And that having that label there allows people simply just to know, if you're purchasing something at a grocery store or even at a farmer's market, if it uses that USDA organic seal, you can be certain that it has has those qualities that you're looking for. Now, there are a number of reasons why people are interested in organic production in agriculture. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. because generally it's not the most useful area to get into a discussion about. But people are interested in organic either because of perceived benefit to the health of the product that they're consuming. So a perception that organic products are healthier. They are, a lot of people are interested in conservation of the environment, and so they're interested in, as preservation of the environment or preservation of biodiversity, in the reduction in the use of synthetic pesticides, and as a part of that, an increased use in cultural controls for pests. There are claims, by some people that organic produce tastes better, um, and certainly, that's one of those things where it's very much dependent on the individual. So probably the most difficult part of that to comment on. And another element of the organic production is people are interested in supporting local small producers in their community. And this is, starting with supporting local small producers, this is absolutely something that whether we consider organic or conventional production, I certainly believe support of local small farmers to be a very important thing, whether that be as the owner or manager of a grocery store, cooperating with local farmers to include their produce as in the grocery store, consumers going to farmers markets and purchasing directly from growers, going to U-pick operations or farm stands. All of those methods of supporting local small farmers are absolutely excellent. I want everybody to be doing that as much as they possibly can. Because not only are you supporting that local small farmer, but the money that you give that producer is going to stay in your community, continue to circulate and benefit your community. You're reducing the environmental impact of agriculture by supporting local small producers as well, because you don't have a lot of the travel time that you would otherwise have for produce. So, the tomato that you buy at the farmer's market, if it's grown by a local producer, hasn't had to travel from southern Florida or from northern Mexico to get here. So just the lack of that travel time certainly is a positive impact environmentally, as well as the economic benefit to the community. And they produce a really great product, which is going to taste really good. So I think, again, supporting small farmers is very important. Um, as for taste, again, that really is a matter of personal perception. And so, if your experience is that organic produce tastes better, then I am absolutely in no position to tell you otherwise. In evaluations that we do in terms of the scientific approach to that is essentially to have a blind tasting of different products, and the results there are fairly mixed in terms of whether there's a benefit to organic production there. And a lot of that really, again, comes down to how fresh the produce is. One thing about organic produce is that it often doesn't have the shelf life that some other products may have. And there certainly is no secret that fresh produce tastes better than produce that has taken its time. So, again, I'm going to bring that back to supporting those local producers because I think that's very important. As far as benefits the environment, that really is an area where there's a lot of questions in terms of what the benefit is, or where there are areas of benefit for organic production. In some areas of organic production, I think it's fairly clear that there is actually a real benefit to the use of an organic product, and that really is in the question of organic fertilization. there's been some fairly good demonstration that the use of organic fertilizers, the use of things like like chicken manure and other materials like that, do have beneficial impacts on soil structure, beneficial impacts on the reduction of leaching of materials out of the soil that can then go on to uh, our water system. Where that question becomes much more much more undecided, I guess, would be in the use of pesticides, specifically organically approved insecticides versus conventional insecticides. Whether those really provide a benefit, essentially you still have a product that is lowering the insect population. They often are not selective, much in the same way that most conventional insecticides are not, and often they need to be applied more frequently because of a reduction in how effective they are at reducing pest populations. One area where I have an absolute support is the increased use of cultural controls for insects and for disease pests. And I will discuss that a little bit later on. Um, as far as benefits to health, I am certainly not a medical doctor, and I wouldn't want to make, I'm not going to make any medical claims. Looking again at the research that's been done on this in terms of identifying benefits to health, the nutritional content of organic food versus conventional food at least seems to be essentially identical. So, in terms of nutritional benefit, I don't see a great deal of science supporting that. Where we see concerns about pesticide levels or things like that, in any case, pesticide levels are below the threshold that's allowed for consumption by people. But ultimately, the other thing that I want to end is because I occasionally come away with kind of a reputation for being down on organic production. And I don't necessarily want to leave you with that impression. What I will say is that I want people to go into organic production with open eyes, and I want to present the most accurate information that I have available on that. If you want to garden organically as a homeowner, I absolutely support you, and I'm happy to help you in any way possible in order to make you successful doing that. But here, particularly in the southeastern United States, it is very challenging, just as an economic prospect, to use organic production at a commercial scale. Speaking of commercial scales, I want to talk just a little bit about the organic certification process. And that organic certification process really only comes into effect if you produce more than $5,000 of produce per year. So if you're producing more than that amount and you're not certified, you cannot use the term organic. You can only use that USDA organic seal if you actually have the certification. That being said, you can absolutely use terms like naturally grown or pesticide free, all natural. There's no regulation whatsoever on those terms. Um, in order to get certified, first, of course, you need to have the level of production or the economic return on production that is going to make you, someone who can be certified. And then you need to contact a certifying agency and they have an application procedure. Currently, there are no organizations in Mississippi that provide organic certification, something that I would really like to see in the future. So we do have people coming from out of state in order to certify any organic farms that we do have. And generally, the process is, you decide you want to be, an organically certified production. You have to fill out an application and submit fees. Um, They will perform an on-site inspection of your production so that you can demonstrate that all of your practices are organic. And then you will need to provide also a actual proof of field history that demonstrates that you haven't had any non-organic inputs for a certain period of time. And generally that is 3 years. So it does take the transition to organic production is something that does take some amount of time. Following your certification, assuming that all of that has gone well, there is an annual review where they will make another visit, inspect that your production on a year-to-year basis, so that you can maintain that certification. So that kind of handles all of that. Now I want to talk about some actual processes and practices for organic production. And I want to start with what I think is probably the most important one, which is organic fertilization. And again, we're looking at an organic fertilizer being one that is composed of something that occurs regularly in nature or naturally, or as the byproduct or end product of some naturally occurring process. So things that would be considered organic fertilizers, and I'll have a longer list as we move forward, would be things like manure products, whether that be from cattle or from poultry, or often things like cotton gin trash would be an organic fertilizer as well. A lot of the fertilizers, because we are needing to make sure that we have all of the components that we need to provide to the plants, there are some materials that are not derived from a living organism that are still accepted for use in organic fertilizers. And limestone or lime would be one of the principles there, but also rock phosphate, which is, of course, mined, or saltpeter. Saltpeter is potassium nitrate. So those materials are mined rather than coming as the end product of a natural process. So some examples of organic fertilizers. Fish emulsion is a common one that I encounter for homeowners. Is a very high amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. Has a good combination of trace elements. Is admittedly not the most pleasant thing to apply because there is a little bit of a smell to it. Certainly, very similarly, fish meal is essentially, these are all both fish byproducts. So again, lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, and a lot of trace elements in that as well. One thing we commonly see for backyard gardens is bone meal, and that is going to have good phosphorus content and good calcium content for plants. Bat guano is a very traditionally used fertilizer. Initially, that was a major issue of contention between some countries. There were islands where bat guano and bird guano had collected, and very important source of things like saltpeter or potassium nitrate, as well as for fertilizer. So it contains all of the major macronutrients, a very good source of fertilizer. Poultry hummus, of course, here in Mississippi, we have a very extensive poultry industry. And so waste products from that, are very important as a fertilizer, and contain all of the macronutrients. So a very good source of fertilizer there. Cottonseed meal or cotton gin trash, a good nitrogen source. People have also used seaweed or kelp meal as a source of micronutrients. Now, there are some significant advantages for organic fertilizers. One of these is that the nutrients are delivered in a way that is essentially a slow release fertilizer. So oftentimes the nitrogen or the phosphorus or the potassium that's in that fertilizer is bound up in a relatively complicated chemical that takes time to break down. And so those nutrients are delivered slowly to the plant. One of the benefits of this is as the water flows through the soil, it's less prone to carry away some of those nutrients with it, so they remain right there for the plant. Additionally, because those nutrients are made available slowly, the potential to apply too much and result in a nutrient burn is somewhat lower, and the nutrients tend to be there for a long time, so they can stick around as the plant is actively growing. One area that I've become very interested in over the past little while is the role of soil microorganisms in promoting plant growth. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about mycorrhizae, but there are a host of microorganisms that live in the soil that are bacteria and fungi that have very close relationships with plants and their roots. And play important roles in making nutrients available, avoiding issues with soil-borne microorganisms and diseases, and in organic production or organic fertilization. Fairly clearly is beneficial to the mass and the activity of the microorganisms in the soil. This is still an area where there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand what's going on, but it does seem to be a really clear benefit of organic fertilization. One other clear benefit is the promotion of good soil structure, particularly as I may have mentioned already, if you have a fairly heavy clay soil or sandy soil, adding organic matter is generally the solution to address that and improve your soil structure. And organic fertilizers essentially are an organic matter that will help address this. On the environmental side of things, you're also using a material that otherwise would be wasted. So there's a benefit in simply reusing or recycling that material to provide those nutrients to your plants. So I mentioned mycorrhizae and soil microorganisms. Mycorrhizae are one example of this. There are a host of others, and they really do have a benefit. They're fungi that are associated with the roots. You can see a picture of that. Both of those pictures on the left show those mycorrhizae, and they do absolutely increase the speed of growth of the plant and the overall health of the plant because they help allow that plant take up nutrients from the soil. It's a relationship where the plant may give off some sugars and help support the fungi, and the fungi kind of trade back those nutrients that are necessary for plant growth. Now, there's always a little bit of a trade-off, so there are some disadvantages to organic fertilization. One of these is very frequently our organic products don't come in a convenient bag with the percentages of nutrients labeled on it. So it can be difficult to determine accurately how much of the nutrients we're actually applying. So in essence, we need to test that material to figure out what its nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium content is in order to really accurately apply that fertilizer to provide all of the nutrients that the plant needs. We don't want to apply too much and we don't want to apply too little. Um, Very frequently, organic fertilizers tend to be relatively low in concentration. One of the conventional fertilizers that we're all very accustomed to is 13, 13, 13, which is 13% nitrogen and 13% phosphorus and 13% potassium. Um, there are examples that are much more concentrated than that are conventional fertilizers, but our organic fertilizers tend to be much lower in that concentration. So they may be 2% nitrogen and 4% of phosphorus and potassium, or even lower than that. And what that means is that in order to apply the amount of nutrients that we need for the plants, we're probably going to have to apply quite a lot. So, if you would need to apply, something like 100 pounds of 10-10-10, if you're applying 2-2-2, you're going to have to apply 5 times as much to make up the actual amount of nutrients that you need. So in large production, that can be limiting, require specialized tools for transplant and distributing, which can be very difficult. Another issue we face is that the sources of phosphorus and potassium tend to be scarce, so that can be an issue. Oftentimes, the cost for organic fertilizers, once you incorporate transport and the material itself, can be prohibitively expensive. And it's also possible that there's some contamination with weed seed or insect pests, things like that. So it's not perfect. Again, there are a lot of benefits to it, but we want to make sure that we're understanding both sides of that. As a personal approach, I think that there is a benefit to a mixed approach in organic and conventional production. I don't think that you necessarily need to be really strictly one thing or the other. And so, using organic fertilizer as you have it available to build soil fertility over time, and supplementing that with conventional fertilizers, um, is very effective and still gives you the benefits in terms of building soil fertility and supporting microorganisms, while giving a nod to some of the difficulties in using a purely organic approach. A really good example of this is if you're producing compost at home. Oftentimes, we do need to add in additional nitrogen in order to get that compost working properly. And still you have a really excellent product for use in your garden. So here are some good examples of some organic fertilizers with the concentrations of nutrients that they tend to have. Again, these are ranges, and because these are natural products, there is going to be variation from one sample to another. But again, just kind of a general idea of what's going on. So, you have some things like blood meal where you have a pretty good nitrogen source. 13% nitrogen is pretty good. A material, of course, I think everybody should be using is compost. That can range anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5% nitrogen, zero point 0.5 to 1 of phosphorus, and 1 to 2 of potassium. So it's not a very strong fertilizer, but as it breaks down, it is providing some of those nutrients to the plant. Cottonseed meal is very good as a source of nitrogen with some of those other nutrients. Fish meal, again, a decent supply of nitrogen and phosphorus, much lower on the potassium. And so when you're looking at, potassium seems to be one where we seem to be lacking that a little bit more. Seaweed is a good source of potassium. And wood ashes can also be a source for potassium as well. As we move forward, of course, there are some commercially available organic fertilizers. And you can see, again, these tend to be lower percentages, but it, certainly makes it a lot more convenient. It's a little questionable to me without the organic material that really makes up a lot of that. How beneficial is it? But still, if you want to go to the garden center and purchase these, they are available and would be allowable within organic production. Another practice that can be really beneficial in promoting uh, further nutrients in the soil, promoting a good soil structure, is the use of green manures. A green manure is essentially growing a cover crop. So Clover or other legumes are frequently used for this because they have the ability to fix nitrogen, to convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that's available for plants to use. They do that by the association of their plant's roots with some bacteria that allow them to use that nitrogen. So you grow this cover crop in the area of your garden in the period of time when you wouldn't be, growing anything else. As it gets to maturity, you simply till it in and allow that material to break back down into forms that are going to be available for your plants to use. And this can be really important to help improve soil structure over time, to integrate some additional nutrients, particularly integrating additional nitrogen in. So really good practice. Again, legumes are very, like clover, are very frequently used to do this. Again, kind of what I was already saying, you're adding in organic matter, um, often used in a rotation with a harvestable crop, adds in that nitrogen, catches and conserves nutrients. So it doesn't allow those nutrients to be leached out because they're bound up in the plant. And if you have issues with erosion, that's also, you have the plants there with their roots in order to be able to maintain the good structure you have there in your soil. Moving along, there's another really important part of organic production, and that is making sure that we select plants that are going to be well adapted to the area that we're growing. Variety choice is an important component of managing abiotic stress, so heat tolerance and water stress, as well as pest problems you may have, whether that be diseases or insects. For organic production, you do need to use organic seed. So you will have, of course, those are very frequently on the label. And be aware, if you're using heirloom varieties, which is very popular with a lot of organic producers, be aware that some of those organic variety or heirloom varieties tend to be a little bit more susceptible to some of our pest problems than some of the hybrid varieties out there are. Weed control can be quite a challenge in organic production. A weed is just a plant that is growing out of place. So occasionally people do ask me whether something is or is not a weed. And I very simply respond with, do you like it? And if they say yes, then it's not. And if they say no, then it is. So weeds compete with the plants that we want to be growing there for soil nutrients and water and light. And that competition can seriously impact the growth of our plants. So maintaining weed control organically, certainly we're not going to be allowed to apply a organic, a herbicide. There are very few effective organic herbicides. So one thing we really want to make sure we're doing is we're providing the absolute best growing conditions for the plants that we're establishing in an area. Weeds can generally grow at a range of different soil conditions. Plants we desire tend to be a little bit more specific. So if we provide the absolute best growth for those plants, they'll be able to outcompete the weeds. So if we have closely seeded crops, we can sort of, just allow no space for the weeds to grow. So crop spacing can also be an effective method for weed control. Again, maintaining the overall health of the plants. One element of weed control that is absolutely necessary is hand removal. So physical removal of weeds either by hand or using a hoe or other tool is going to be a part of organic weed management. It is very time consuming, and certainly the labor involved in that is going to be a consideration. Mulches are very effective at reducing weed problems, simply providing a physical barrier to the seedlings or preventing light from being able to access those weeds. Insect pest control is an area where I very frequently get questions for organic production. Insect pests, of course, can be very damaging to plants, whether that be through direct feeding or indirectly by transmission of disease. and they tend to build throughout the growing season. So problems tend to be worse as we move into the later parts of the year, particularly for insects where they have multiple generations in a year, because that population can get larger at each generation. So I am absolutely an advocate for what is called integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is the use of multiple strategies in order to provide effective control of pests. And so, as part of integrated pest management, we want to make sure we know what's going on. We want to make sure that we're doing everything culturally that we can. But the use of pesticides will also be an important element in IPM, or integrated pest management. One of the best things we can do for managing pests is to know what's there. So monitoring insect pests regularly, keeping an eye on their population levels, and treating for them when they reach a point where they're damaging is going to be very important. But being out in your garden and seeing what's there and checking for pests is one of the most important strategies we have. Again, using multiple types of control is going to increase the efficacy of that control. And we want to keep records from year to year so we know what problems we've had, so we can adjust our practices if we need to. Of course, it is very important to know your insect pests for the crops you grow, because particularly when we're talking about organic controls, it's going to be very important to choosing what controls we're going to use, how we would want to manage something like a 12 spotted cucumber beetle, which you see down in the bottom picture, versus managing a stink bug can be quite different. So certainly, there are excellent garden books that you can use for identification, but you can also always contact your county extension office, and they can help you by providing you with an ID for that problem, as well as recommendations for control. Now, in terms of cultural control for insect pests, there are several elements to that. Crop selection is a big part of that. Some crops just have fewer pests than others. I list tomatoes and sweet corn as two examples. Tomatoes have, of course, some significant caterpillar pests. In contrast, sweet corn really only has a one really big pest that is a major issue called corn earworm that's going to make growing sweet corn extraordinarily difficult organically. Um, the other example I always think of is something like okra, because it just doesn't seem to have anywhere near as many problems as some of our other crops do. Of course, going back to variety selection, you do want to select varieties that are resistant for pests that are very likely to show up, as well as for diseases that they might transmit. Can be very important. And planting early, growing plants when pest populations are low, is going to be an important thing as well. If you can get in early before those populations get high, then you can avoid a lot of those problems. And in some cases, things like melons, bean leaf beetles, actually planting a little bit later can be beneficial because they have already migrated off to other crops by the time you put in yours. One thing that can absolutely be a benefit is crop rotation. Growing the crop in the same location year to year allows that pest population to build up in the area. So if you alternate years with other crops, a little bit difficult to do for a home gardener because we do tend to grow a range of things that are always going to present a potential host for problems. We also want to maintain good weed control because weeds can serve as an alternative host for insect pests. A good example of that is flea beetles, which are very commonly a problem on beans and some other crops. They are very fond of horse nettle, which is a very common weed that we have in our landscape. So removing horse nettle can reduce the populations of flea beetles. So tilling is another element of this, which helps reduce weed pressure, but can also get rid of any soil insects like cutworms that overwinter in soil. It's also possible to use trap crops. These are planted away from your main crop, and they're very attractive to some significant pests. Sunflower is very attractive to leaf-footed bugs. Collards are used to attract away diamondback moths. Southern peas can be used for stink bugs. The trick with a trap crop is that you do need to spring the trap. So once that population becomes established on your trap crop, it's important to go ahead and apply a control there in order to knock out that population. Otherwise, the population will build up to a point where it can spread off to the desired plants or the crop you're actually growing. So again, it's very important to get effective control on that trap crop. Sanitation, I've preached that for a number of different presentations. It can be very effective. So destroying old crop residue can get rid of immature insects, get rid of overwintering sites for egg laying, and help reduce populations in the area. And there are some specialized things that can be done here with reflective mulches that are, that tend to prevent populations of thrips and aphids and things like that. Mechanical control is also possible. That's just putting up a physical barrier. So things like low tunnels, which you see down there at the bottom, just present a physical barrier to entry for the insect. Just keep in mind that we'll have to come up when the temperature gets higher. And you will, if it's an insect pollinated plant, you will need to provide access to pollinators. A really good example of this that works very effectively for cutworms. Cutworms live in the soil. They come up and they just go right through the bottom of the plant. So putting a collar around the plant, like you see up there in that top image, just confuses the cutworm and it can't find your plant, so it can't feed on it. So it's a very effective control. One area that people are really interested in is biological control. And this is the use of a predator or parasite or pathogen for insects in order to control pest populations. Most people are familiar with this with something like releasing lady beetles into their garden. And certainly, lady beetles are very effective at reducing aphid populations. The problem is that unless they're in a fairly small area, it's difficult to keep the population of lady beetles high enough around your garden in order to actually get effective control. And there are some special cases of this where you may introduce another plant. Barley is a common example, and allow a population of aphids to grow on that barley that don't grow on other kinds of plants, like the plants that we're growing in our vegetable gardens. And that helps you maintain those insect predator populations. Other examples are braconid wasps. They are parasitoids, so they're immatures grow inside caterpillars in this particular instance. That middle picture has all of those little cocoons on it. Those are all the immature wasps coming out to come out of that caterpillar. That you can barely see the caterpillar in that picture. And certainly there are some other examples like insect, pathogenic nematodes or insect parasitic nematodes, or even fungi that can be used as a biological control for insect pests. Is very broadly used in greenhouses because that controlled space allows you to keep those beneficial insects in the target area. Of course, the use of pesticides is still going to be important as part of organic insect control. So there are organically approved chemicals. These are produced from some natural source. Spinosad is a really good example. It's very effective against caterpillars. You can use it for fire ants in some formulations. And it, very much like the most famous of the organic insecticides, is produced by a soil-borne microbe. And you do want to be careful, though, when you look at that. Make sure that it does label itself organic, because oftentimes there's some other ingredients that go into that bottle that may disallow its use as an organic insecticide. BT, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, is probably the most famous of the organic insecticides. Again, made by a soil microbe, and is a principal is of course also the component in things like BT cotton and BT corn, which are genetically engineered to produce the same protein that the bacteria uses to kill insects. It is very effective. At least there are several versions of BT or strains of BT that are effective against different groups of insects. The most common one we see is BT kurtoski, which is used for caterpillars. But there's also a form of BT that's used for fly control, um, and a few other ones as well. Azadirachtin is made from the same tree that neem oil is. Pyrethrins come from the pyrethrum daisy. Pyrethrum is the non-organic form that's made in a lab. They essentially work identically the same, but it's very good. It has a wide range of activity against different insects. Neem oil and other horticultural oils are an insecticidal soap are broadly used as organic insecticides. They're essentially suffocants. Um, so you have to get really good coverage on the tree and physically come in contact with the insect. And essentially, sometimes they have a kind of an anti-feedant effect, so the insect doesn't want to eat. But also, they just kind of cover the insect and prevent it from getting any oxygen. Sulfur, not one that I see very often, but it's been used for controlling spider mites. All right, organic disease control or management is going to include a lot of cultural controls as well. Sanitation is always going to be very important to that. There are some biological controls and some approved organic chemicals. These practices are all there to reduce populations of pathogens causing disease. And again, you're going to want to use a combination of these treatments, and you need to have a really good identification of what's going on in order to provide an effective control to what the problem is that you're experiencing. So it's always good to familiarize yourself with the diseases of the plants that you grow. But I worked in plant pathology for quite a while, and I still get confused with a lot of the plant diseases. But again, your county extension office is there as a really effective way to make sure that you have a good diagnosis of the problem. I've mentioned this many times. Sanitation is, I think, absolutely the most important element in disease management. Getting rid of any crop debris, eliminating overwintering sites for these disease pathogens will seriously reduce the amount of problems that you have in the next year. Plowing under any remaining stubble if you can. Disinfecting the materials that you work with, if you use tomato cages or pots, disinfecting those using a bleach solution or a vinegar solution can be very effective. You certainly want to avoid the introduction of disease, so making sure that you're using healthy transplants or disease-free seeds. Don't save seeds from areas where you have a history of a disease problem. Buy good certified seed, um, and sow them in a sterile growth medium, a core material, or peat moss, rather than in a native soil. Again, disinfecting your flats, either using bleach or copper sulfate, is going to be very effective. And remove any weeds, because just like for insects, those can serve as a reservoir for areas for diseases that can move on to your crops. It's also important you have a good site, so good drainage, so your soil moisture is even, preventing that abiotic stress. A lot of soil-borne pathogens are much more serious in areas where you have standing water or poor drainage. Raised beds certainly offer an opportunity to improve the drainage characteristics of where you're growing. Make sure you're providing good nutrition, right plant spacing, again, rotating crops, because just like as we mentioned before, You can group plants into their families. So like Group A down there are all in the Cucurbitaceae. Group B are brassicas. Group C are the solanaceous plants. And they tend to share many of the same characteristics, and they tend to have experience the same problems. So just rotating within your garden of the different areas where you're growing these plants can be very effective at limiting the disease problems that you have. Again, physical controls can be important. So plastic or organic mulch layers, preventing contact of the plant with the soil, can prevent the splashing of disease inoculum up onto the plant, the foliage, and reduce its spread. Um, Staking and trellising plants again will keep them up off the ground. Not only makes them easier to work with, but also reduces disease problems because they're not in contact with the soil. You can even wrap the base of the plant. You can see the squash plant there that's wrapped down at the bottom with just a little bit of aluminum foil. And that helps prevent contact with the soil to prevent some fungal diseases. Row covers, again, work very effectively as just a physical barrier to prevent spores from being able to, the spores of the fungi or even of the bacteria from splashing up on the plant leaves. They're not going to be able to drift in on the wind. So that's very effective. But again, sanitation is very important. Cleaning up and removing any potential sources for disease. Cultivate plants when they're dry so you're not splashing water around. Try to avoid getting soil or other material up onto the foliage. And cleaning your tools as you're working. Just keep a bucket handy with a bleach or vinegar solution. And that can be a very effective way just to make sure you're not transporting disease from one area of the garden to another. And again, there are some organically approved chemicals for control. One of the oldest of these is the Bordeaux mixture, which is a mixture of copper sulfate and hydrated lime. You can still purchase it in garden stores or mix it yourself if you would like to. I would recommend that you purchase it to make sure it's mixed correctly. And you want to be careful. And just like with any product, you want to read the label and make sure that you follow those directions because organic and safe don't necessarily mean the same thing. We want to make sure that we're not going to have any interaction with the plant or um, potential stress or interactions with other products that you're using. Finally, there are some biological controls for some diseases. Resistant varieties, I think, are the most important component of that. Knowing what problems you have experienced in the past is going to be an important part of selecting the varieties that you use to be resistant to those problems. One that I particularly like, nematodes, which get grouped with plant pathology, despite being little worms that live in the soil. Uh, French marigolds particularly produce a chemical that will drive away those nematodes, particularly root knot nematode. And I've seen some pretty good responses with planting marigolds in those areas to help reduce the pressure from nematodes. Of course, crop rotation is going to be really important as part of that too, because ultimately you want to keep that population down below the level where it can cause you any harm. So I appreciate you taking time to listen today. I hope you picked something up from it. If you have any questions and you are listening to the recording of this presentation, again, I encourage you to to put your question down in the comment section. I will be very happy to answer that for you to the best of my ability. And you can also hit the subscribe button, which will let you know when future presentations are coming out.